So hi everyone and welcome. My name is Sam Randall. I'm with the Arbor Institute, and I'll switch to my video in a moment, but thought I'd leave this graphic up for just a little bit while we have folks joining us at the top of the hour. Welcome to Sustainability in the Arts for the Uninitiated, or as we like to say, from climate anxiety to climate action, greening your arts practices. I'm glad you could join us tonight. We're very honored and thrilled to co-host this program along with the Boulder County Arts Alliance and Eco Arts Connections, and with the support of the City of Boulder Office of Arts and Culture and Colorado Creative Industries and the Scientific Culture and Facilities District. So welcome. I know we'll have a few people joining us in those first few moments, but I'm glad that you've all arrived. Switch over here a moment. There we go. Now I can see you all. So as I said, my name is Sam Randall. I'm with the Arbor Institute. We are a new creative nonprofit in Boulder that combines art and contemplative practice with ecological experience. So we host multidisciplinary artists, artworks, events, installations, and dialogues that help to reconnect us with each other and with the earth. Part of our mission is to help people to feel deeply and see clearly and act wisely so that we can nurture a healthy, thriving planet together. In that spirit, I'd like to actually invite us before we get started to connect a little bit. What we see and so many are seeing across the world is that the root of the climate crisis is disconnection. Disconnection from each other, disconnection from the earth, disconnection from the realities of human activity and our impact on the planet. So if you'll join me, I just invite you for a moment before we start our program to connect. And we'll start, if you're comfortable, as you're comfortable, if you could close your eyes or you can leave them open, but maybe a soft focus. And first of all, just connect in with yourself and with your body, in whatever room or space that you're in. And as others are arriving, please join us. We're just taking a moment to settle in and arrive together here in our bodies. You might take notice of what's going on in your mind. Perhaps you had a full day. Mind is kind of racing a little bit. Or curious of what's going to happen, looping, quiet, joyful. Take a moment and notice how your body feels. Is there tension anywhere? Maybe take a few deep breaths as we arrive together here. Feel the weight of your body on your seat. And feel yourself start to settle in. And as we connect into our bodies, we can connect into the earth. Feel yourself sitting in the chair that you're in, or on the floor. If you're inside or outside, notice the quality of the light, the sounds around you. Connect through your seat to the floor or the ground beneath you. If you're in a building, you might even imagine that you can visualize the foundation of that building going down, being supported by the earth, and extending that support all the way down into the earth, feeling it here with us. Breathing with the earth, as the earth. And those just arriving, we're taking a moment to connect in with our bodies and connecting through our bodies to this earth which supports us. And as you feel that support, now we connect into the group. You can open your eyes if you'd like. Notice the people on the screen, all of us here, united in our care for the earth. United in wanting to learn how we might create positive change. Coming together tonight from all over the country, each in our own spaces, but together in this field and on this planet. I welcome you to open your eyes. And as we transition into the program, see if you can maintain that awareness in these digital spaces. It's very easy to be caught up in our head. And really a lot of what we're talking about tonight is a very embodied approach to living and making and practicing in the world. And so I invite you to stay tuned in to yourself and to your breath and your body as we connect with our program. We have a few guidelines and welcome those who continue to join. Again, my name is Sam Randall. I'm with the Arbor Institute, and we're glad to be hosting this program tonight with Boulder County Arts Alliance and Eco Arts Connections. Right now, you may have us just on gallery view, but just a reminder that you might want to switch to speaker view as we transition into the program. That way you can feel the most connected with our speaker, with Ian. When we go to the question and answer at the end, we will, you're welcome to switch back into gallery view and then use speaker view as people are asking and responding to the questions. Please a reminder to stay on mute during the program. During Q&A, we will do that using the participant raise hand in the participants menu at the bottom. I think most people by now are Zoom pros. If you're not and you're new to that, feel free to message me through the participant chat if you need to, and I can assist. But there should be, if you click on participants and look at the bottom of your box there, the menu, there should be a blue hand to the left. That when we get to the Q&A, you're welcome to click that, and then Ian will call on people in succession as they show up there. And then you'll be invited to unmute and to ask your question, and then mute afterwards. I'll remind you at the beginning of the Q&A about that. We are recording this session, so just so you know, for the Boulder County Arts Alliance Library, if you would prefer to not have your video on during the gallery view, of course, we invite you to do that or have your name private, but the video will be recorded. We began that right at the top of the hour. And again, if you have any issues, feel free to private message me in the chat and I'll try to assist. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it to Marta Kern with Eco Arts Connections, who will introduce our speaker. And again, welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Sam. I feel like my brain went, and then all of a sudden I went, Thank you so much for that. That introduction was really terrific. Everybody who's here, thank you so much for coming. And it's just my greatest pleasure to introduce Ian Garrett. And I'm going to read from notes because my background is dance and I'm always terrified of forgetting what I was going to say. This is going to be really brief introduction because Ian is going to be talking about his work in just a moment. But just to say that I've known Ian for years as really the sort of go-to guru of greening arts practices. First here in the US and now in Canada. He's an absolute international pioneer in this work. He's the co-founder of CISPA, which is the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts, which has evolved from a place, I have to say, Ian, sorry, a funky place in the very beginning, where you could go to find out how to reduce your greenhouse gases with LED lights and things like that, to now an incredible think tank and website of resources for sustainability in the arts and culture. And it's ever evolving as it really in the forefront to now really looking at sustainability at the intersection, and I'm reading this from the website, of environmental balance, social equity, economic stability, and a strengthened cultural infrastructure. Ian also these days is the Associate Professor of Ecological Design at, for Performance at York University in Toronto. He's the producer for the US-Canadian company Toaster Lab. And the director of the Center for Sustainable Practice in the Arts. But he's also a practicing artist and has a design practice focused on the integration of ecology, technology, and scenography. With Chantal Bilodeau, he directs the international biannual Climate Change Theater Action Project. And if you Google artists and climate change, it's an incredible wealth of things in addition. Ian has also spoken and written about and consulted on the arts and the environment all around the world. I always think of you, Ian, as having sort of an intergalactic presence internationally. One of the things I value so much about Ian and his work is if you look at the entire ecosystem of the arts, and now I'm thinking of arts makers, producers, presenters, administrators, funders, service organizations, policymakers, allies, audiences, collaborators, wannabe collaborators, and others, Ian has worked deeply and systemically with all of the above to help move the needle from sustainability awareness to action, or as the I Ching says, making energetic progress toward the good. And he's a regular and approachable human being. So it gives me the greatest delight to present to you, Ian Garrett. Take it away, Ian.
Thanks, Marta. I do really appreciate that you ended with the approachable part, because when you get through the bio, sometimes it's like, oh, like, is this guy gonna have time for me? And this is an interesting time to be shifting, because as you point out, Marta, my life in the before times, as I refer to times before about mid-March, before the Ides of March, did involve a decent amount of travel, which in my own personal process of drawdown. And now I find myself very much located in what you can't tell is actually a relatively small room, hence virtual backgrounds and additional lighting. To continue to do this way. It's been an interesting transition, because in that drawdown period, it's also been part of my desire to move away from, to move to sort of this remote format to reduce my own carbon footprint before. And now I find that process has become really useful. As I'm starting, and I'll share my screen in a moment, I realize I have a little bit of a robotic. I'm here at twilight in Toronto, and I realize that things will be getting darker as the world continues to turn. We're in Boulder over the period of our time together, but as such, I'm reliant on the artificial lighting in this room, which typically during the day gets a nice bright sun, especially in the morning. I do want to acknowledge, and acknowledgements have gotten interesting in this COVID time. Here I am in Toronto. The name derives from Toronto, and it's an area that's the traditional caretakers have included the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It's now home to many Indigenous peoples as well, but it's known as with current treaty holders, the Mississauga, the First Credit Nation, and is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And it's and I'm excited to, through these cyberspace connections, be coming to you on what in my and learning about the area has traditionally been Arapaho and Cheyenne land. The CSPA also, and we put out a very brief statement recently, because it felt like the best way for us to work, and oftentimes is best to work, is to decentralize our voice and to hold up other voices, and to work most of our work happens in partnership. But we stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. We do see social justice and eco-justice as very interrelated things. And I, as a white man in Canada, in a tenured faculty position, benefit from a significant amount of systemic and institutional privilege. So I acknowledge that coming into this space as well. And finally, the other acknowledgement that I've been adding into things recently is talking about the platforms that we use and their dependency on technology, and things like the problematic use of Zoom concerning user privacy and security and safety. It's brought us together in certain ways, but also has created challenges in other ways that might reinforce other systemic issues in society. I'm going to share my screen now and move into the presentation part of it. So we should be there now, and you have my audio as well. So hello from over here in Toronto. I'm Ian Garrett. A little bit about myself. Marta mentioned a number of these things, but I thought that I'd also give you a little bit of visual reference as well. There we go. My own practice, my own background as an artist is primarily within performance and installation, experiential type of work. I've included a couple of samples there, working from overnight installations here in Toronto with a program we have called Nuit Blanche, dance performance, installations in large crowds, etc. And a big part of my own sort of portfolio of work is as a parent as well. And you can see my son, who is now much larger than he was in this central up center photo here, with me at a tech table working on a show. As Marta mentioned, I teach at York University. Here's some of that in action. I primarily focus on lighting and video work, so a lot of my work does carry over into technology, but I also focus a lot on sustainability within there. One of the reasons that I'm now in Canada is that it brought me into this department that was invested in the topic of sustainability and teaching that as a design practice. I co-run a company called Toaster Lab that does mixed reality performance, which actually comes out of an ecological practice of looking at sight and our relationship to it, both human and non-human actors, and how we can use accessible technology to access that. And a lot of the work that I end up doing is in a devised method. I have a long history with an organization called Indie Convergence in Indianapolis. And for a number of years, I've been involved with the US exhibition at the Prague Quadrennial, which you can see sort of 2003 below, and the most recent exhibition above. And my research profile includes workshops, not entirely unlike this one, in many different types of rooms. There's different pictures of different rooms there, and a number of publications around this topic. So trying to bring all these things together, it's hopefully a diverse practice, but that each part of it works to inform each other. And it leaves me thinking about a lot. As Marta mentioned, the CSPA, we frame it as a think tank, and a lot of it is about bringing together thinkers to think about how we engage sustainability socially. One of the things that I think about a lot is my own kids. Here are my kids this last winter, enjoying a little bit of a sled ride. But I also think about beauty and destruction and what's happening with our world. This is actually from a series of photos in a publication called Beautiful Destruction by a photographer named Louis Helbig, who's looking at the, who does aerial photographs of the tar sands in northern Alberta, and this is a bitumen tailing pond during the winter. Or artists like Brandon Bellinger, who has a hybrid practice as both a biologist, working with indicator species, especially around insects and amphibians, but then brings that work into an arts context, in this case, doing around mutation around amphibians and looking at them as large art prints. Or performative work that articulates the changes that we'll be looking at within society, even with small actions like Yves Mosher's high water line, which looks at using a base chalker to redraw the coastlines in various cities, in this case, where she started in New York on the island of Manhattan and redrawing that coastline. Or Michael Pinsey's plunge, which does a similar work by placing glowing halos around monuments in central London at levels of future projected sea level with our changing climate. Or Lars Jan's piece Holocene, which had performers attempting to create domestic tasks, repetitive domestic tasks, while a tank at another projected high water level filled and emptied rapidly in a cycle, to get a visceral feeling for what these type of changes that would happen. Or in traditional theaters themselves, with DJ Spooky here on the left and Cynthia Hopkins on the right, both artists who had participated in the Cape Farewell project, which sent artists with climate scientists on Arctic expeditions together with no specific intent, but to create something that responded to their experience. Both of them creating performance projects out of this, but many other artists have been involved with this as well, to more direct and recognizable theater forms, including the recently touring Alana Mitchell Seasick, which you'll see in the upper right there, talking about ocean acidification, which had been touring internationally until its run had been cut short, or its travel had been cut short. Superhero Clubhouse, which is a company out of New York that has developed a cycle of climate plays or plays associated with different environmental issues, each named after the planets in their planetary cycle. And my partner in the CCTA, Chantal Bilodeau, and her own work through the Arctic Cycle, which is both her organization and her series of plays about various complicated environmental issues. Here, a production of her play Sela from New Hampshire. And a lot of these come into this interplay and sort of, I want to get to an idea in this moment, and I know that we don't have a lot of time together, so we will in some ways just cover a sort of a brief surface of things. But I want to pull attention to a specific piece of performance, which is the only thing that will go against some of the best practices around presentations, which is around having a lot of text on screen, which I will read for you for dramatic effect, though I typically do not consider myself a performer. But for this, it gives this understanding of starting to understand where art exists within this cultural balance and why using it as a driver of sustainable societies becomes important to me, and sort of the framework by which we work through the types of projects, the type of research that we do with the CSBA. So bear with me for this text. I promise that we've got dancing robots coming up. So there's all types of content here. So this comes from a performance called An Evening with William Shatner, asterisk, and asterisk because there is another touring production of An Evening with William Shatner, which is actually An Evening with William Shatner. And William Shatner is not actually in this performance. That's what the asterisk is for. It's a talk, effectively, on the relationship between art and science and the reciprocal back and forth between those, looking towards the future, told through an algorithm that pulls the words and syllables from a William Shatner's representation of James Tiberius Kirk in the original series of Star Trek. So is appearing on the screen. And it goes this way. So art must start with experience of an object, object out of material. Art can use any material as long as it is an object. There's a limit to, me editorializing, but there's a limit to the number of syllables that are said in the original series. But art does not make observations about the object. The object is not the point is the experience of the object. Art makes experience out of objects. And I'll jump ahead. Now, experience itself is a type of object, and science can make observations about human perception. Human perception is a type of phenomena. So science can make data out of experience. What this means is that there's a special kind of art and a special kind of science that point to each other and go through this cycle. And this is sort of where we are with the CSBA. a friend, an actor who's currently based in Minneapolis, once described as what we're doing is making art about data about art, as that we're observing these things and looking at the creative expression or how to share them. So let's dive into some of the information that gets us to this point. One is just starting with what we mean when we're talking about sustainability. Many people may have processed this already. It's much more common, but it's a question that comes up very frequently insofar as our work. What exactly do we mean here? And we primarily pull it right out of the definition that's associated with sustainable development within a UN context, what happens in the annual climate change conversation, and what originated that with the Brundtland Commission report that came out in 1983, that sustainability is about the accelerating deterioration of the human environment and natural resources, the consequences of that deterioration for economic and social development. That what we're looking for is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. This is the origin for what you may have heard as the basis for the environmental, economic, and socio-political. Maybe it's the 3 dimensions of sustainability or the triple bottom line. It's had many metaphors to it. The one that we subscribe to primarily is the nested model of sustainability, which will be along with a little bit additional information. So first, sort of referring to what this nested model is, this is the graphic that you see on the right-hand side of the screen here, is that everything is nested within the environment. Every choice that we make, everything that we do cannot be separated from the environment, so it is always a consideration. So when we're talking about sustainability, any economic or social decisions that we make does have an impact on the environment. It might be more obvious or not. And that within the environment, we have our societies, the structures that we build around each other to perform our interconnection with each other. And then we determine economies within that. That's our way of exchanging value within our societies. You're not going to have much by way of an economy outside of society, and society can't exist outside of the environment. We don't have an extra universal way of working. But here are things that we've seen in our research as being true, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because we have limited time here today, but this has been the basis for the last decade and a half of research that we've been doing and looking at these different aspects of the way that these social, economic, and environmental aspects of sustainability and sustainable development worked. That we've seen as sort of the trends. One is that the arts serve as a demonstrable community and individual identity and social value building tool, both in terms of the instrumental impacts, which tend to be things around test scores, health impacts, etc., and then also in intrinsic impacts, which is actually about the sense of self, the sense of community, and how we communicate with each other. There's a growing, this is a growing field of research, intrinsic impact, primarily led and originating out of the RAND Corporation and then Wolf Brown as a research body, but looking at the affect of art within communities and how it works on society. Another thing that we've seen is that the arts are drivers of local economies with financial impacts as high as 4 times, and this is based off of US data, for of return on investment, if you want to put it in those terms, from public funding sources. And we see this in the way that it pulls people into various places and not only impacts the economy in terms of providing a large sector, a large impact on GDP in terms of individual jobs and tax revenue, but then also the spending that goes along with having arts events and those sort of community activities from local restaurants, bars, etc. All of those things come together, and that money tends to stay in the community. Where at one point, the number that we would work with was that in most communities, you'd see about a $26 over ticket spending on average in the overall economic impact. And the other thing that we've seen, and perhaps one of the reasons that you're most interested in and what I'm saying today is that in the greater context of environmental impacts of human activities, when there's a choice between an arts or cultural experience versus any other activity, staying home, which has become problematized in our current reality, that that shows a trend towards the arts actually being good for the environment. So let's start from this place as our first place. Is that our rationale is that the arts are in many ways good for the environment, good for sustainability. They are drivers of sustainable societies. And if you were to do nothing else but to make work that people engaged with, that functioned as art in the society, creating conversations and these identity phase, and did nothing else towards examining, you'd still be doing something that would be good towards the sustainable futures. So we start from a place of positive impact that we're looking at. And when we get into the practical sort of different ways that people can approach sustainability within arts context, it becomes something that it becomes very specific, it becomes values driven, it becomes about what you can do. In terms of values, I've broken things down now into sort of like 3 different focus areas of how we prioritize a lot of the different approaches that we take to things. And I've attached those, though we won't go into the sustainable development goals individually. I've attached each of the indicators and the individual icons that are provided by the UN on talking about what those sustainable development goals are. You'll see those in the intro slides for the 3 sections we're talking about. So the first thing that I want to, and there's a little bit of a reference here, sometimes I play a game with the audience to see who catches all of them. I don't have a way of giving you a prize this time, but we'll see what happens. So the first part that I want to talk about is actually around infrastructure. And thinking about the systems in which we work, and sort of thinking about why we should sort of value our interconnection with things. So 2 things to keep in mind as we do this, that a lot of the work that we're doing is around systems thinking and understanding how things influence one another within a whole, and admitting that we're dealing with wicked problems, which are effectively problems that defy solution mainly because of their complexity. They're hard to solve because there's so many moving parts to it. And part of that is also releasing us from the we're never going to come up, this idea of coming up with a perfect solution. We'll come up with really great solutions for us that will work towards a positive future. But just as to critique society, we still exist within society. To make positive, sustainable environmental change, we will still be having an impact. We can't completely give that up without still participating. So maps tell us a little bit about the story that we're trying to tell about a place. For instance, this is from a project called nativeland.ca or native-land.ca if you want to go to it online. There's also an associated app. And what it does is it actually shows you a mapping of previous indigenous territory or territory areas in a community-driven project around Turtle Island, around what is now North America, itself a colonial name based off of Amerigo Vespucci. And what's interesting about it, if you spend some time with it, is that it tells a story about how we use resources. That larger areas involve places where food security depended upon larger areas, and then there are areas, especially like in the California coast, where we've collaborated with a number of people, where the food security issues and the social structures led to smaller territories. And this becomes the way that these different areas intersect with each other. But there are other ways of expressing this as well, though this is now nearly a 20-year-old diagram. It's from 1998, so by nearly I mean more than. It shows arterial traffic throughout the United States, at least the 50 states, not the extra national territories under US control. And you can sort of see a story of where people are and where goods are moving to and from and how they move from place to place, because this is highway traffic based off of trucks moving things from place to place. We can tell a story about power around this when we talk about the national grid of power. This is the distribution. And it's interesting because it's not actually a grid. That metaphor is inaccurate for it. But each of those different color lines also show incompatibility, where you have to transfer power from one way to another. So we start to talk about how resources move around and become localized and become specific. And at some point, sometimes the infrastructure also becomes abstract. This is actually not a map, but a visualization of a day, pre-COVID times, of air traffic across North America. But you can see where people are located, and you can see where air travel hubs exist. So you can see a couple of cities in Texas there very clearly, Southern California, jumping over to Hawaii, and this is sort of a day of traffic. So you can see where people are moving around, and you can see where people specifically who have access to or would be using air travel on a regular basis have access to, and how that infrastructure lines up. But we're at a moment now also, and we're experiencing this viscerally, that our infrastructure looks a little bit like this. This is a map from a few years ago of a visualization of the surface web. This is all the interconnected nodes. This is the internet, essentially. Things that are visible by a Google search. There are things that are not, that are in here. It shows how each of those things connect. And the reason to highlight these various things is that as we're looking at our cultural creation, a lot of it and our relationship to sustainability connects back to the metaphors and the structures of infrastructure that we're imagining. So one of the areas in which we're thinking ahead right now, and a lot, especially arts organizations, and just about every performance organization that I know at this moment, is grappling with the change of this evolution that I just showed you, from physically moving people around in local and regional ways to different ways of travel that close the distance between places but still was recognizable in its previous form. Now we're looking at this abstract form where we're moving things around. There are a couple of different initiatives that have happened around this way of thinking that have changed the way that we think about how we can move and think about our cultural impacts and production models towards a sustainable end. We talked about the climate change theater action before. This is just sort of a screenshot of its site. It's a semi-annual, every 2 years, event in odd years that commissions 50 playwrights to write new, short, about 5-minute long climate change plays. They're paid to do that. And then it makes them available for a global audience and a global production network of people that's been growing for free to be able to use them. And the only thing that you need to do to say that you're a CCTA event is to use one of the plays. And we prefer if you tell us when it's happening, and then it goes onto the website, it gets mapped there. It's an idea of flipping around the distributed festival where we're releasing it to the audience in a way to do it. We're taking that digital infrastructure and saying, instead of congregating into one place, what are ways that we can redistribute and rethink the way that we're distributing the content and look at what the production model is. What are the things that we can relinquish from our control, especially if we consider things like touring, that allow us to still maintain some connection. And what's lovely about this is that this takes a lot of different forms, from events in schools with children, to cafes, to street events, to things in university settings, etc. One of the other aspects that happened along with this is with a group here in Toronto called Triga Creative, which is a group of stage designers. So in addition to sending the plays around, that there's now a working model for how to generate and seed ideas for design around these. And this has also evolved into other production contexts, so that the work has evolved with companies who have engaged with it and turned into either expanding the plays or looking at future ways of doing that. So we're looking at how our cultural production might line up with infrastructure. And again, I'm focusing on this a little bit because of our connection to the current moment of distributing, especially performance work. But I'll also highlight a production that was done in Ottawa, a play that was done for streaming well before, nearly a year before our current situation of streaming as the only way to relate to performance content, but it was performed to a camera and switched in a hybrid model of making it available for people so they wouldn't necessarily be able to travel or be required to travel. It's related to another project that has just completed here in Canada at the National Arts Centre around around creating a distributed model for conferencing around the art and talking about artistic content that, as with many conferences and this type of event included, have moved online for that type of content, but from its initial inception was based around this idea of how can we minimize the major travel, the travel like overseas and international travel, to keep it as local as possible. Now, one of the things that this has done, and one of the points is keeping in mind that this doesn't necessarily eliminate the carbon footprint of production. There is the reduction in travel. There is the reduction in moving freight from place to place. You're not dealing with something like the extent of a Broadway show, which is moving 30 trucks, but it does have its own impact as well. This is a study from last year that was looking at music streaming. We don't have information about the current streaming methodology, but that like physical production over to different modes of consumption does have an impact. Now, why this is important. There is a concept that hopefully some people are familiar with, maybe you're not, around embodied carbon. You might also know it as an embodied energy or embedded carbon. And this is the idea that within the life cycle that we're analyzing of the types of productions that we're doing or the types of arts events that we're creating, that to create them first, we go through a process of material extraction. We have to transport that material from one place to another. It has to be manufactured into whatever form that we want to use it in. It likely has to be transported again to the place where it's going to be used. It will go into use and then have the end of life and have its disposal. Within those working in sustainability and life cycle analysis, we sort of divide this into two areas where we have the cradle to grate phase, which is getting it from the virgin material all the way to the loading dock, and then the full life cycle of what that looks like. But what this means is that for something like a laptop, is that by the time that it reaches us, there's already the equivalent about 2,000 kilowatts of electricity being used. Everything from the pen in your hand to all the technology that we're using includes these aspects. So though we might be less carbon intensive in some ways, we are creating emissions through ways that might not be visible to us. In fact, when we're right now working electronically so much, whenever we send an email, that has an estimated carbon equivalent associated with it as well. From the quick one that we jot off that might put about 4 grams of CO2 equivalents into the atmosphere, until something with lots of attachments. And so much of that has to do with this background that is all these servers that are working in the background, that are consuming energy and themselves have to be manufactured as well. But our main interface tends to be something along the lines of this. This is a Nest fire detector, so it's a part of the Internet of Things. And I find it more interesting than the Nest thermostat because it is aware of what room that it's in and can send you smart notifications around carbon monoxide and flame detection. So not only will you know that there is a fire in your house, but you'll know where it is in your house. And we're seeing a way of interacting with all of these different things through digital interfaces that are giving us a backend for how they're connected to each other. But why is that relevant within our cultural context? Well, giving an extreme example, this is 2 different opera houses. We've got the empty Sydney Opera House on the left-hand side and the full Seattle Opera House on the right-hand side. And many of our cultural facilities are oriented towards this full state in which we're bringing in audiences, which isn't something that's happening right now for obvious reasons, and will modify in the future. And because of that, the infrastructure that goes into lighting that, to cooling that, becomes extensive. Now, there are multiple ways in which this has been dealt with of late, with people trying to address this dichotomy of when we're installing something versus the capacity that we're looking to give that artistic experience with. The Portland Center Stage in Portland, Oregon, which has the first LEED certified LEED Platinum certified theatrical facility, reused a building and integrated many innovative technologies into what they were doing in the construction of a new facility. might not always be the case, as something that's available to somebody, but looking at these certification standards as a way of looking at how our facilities can become as efficient as possible, especially as we have this interconnected way of managing them and managing them in the context of our greater infrastructure in terms of digital connection and power distribution. Similarly, but a less ambitious project that sort of has two sides to it. This is the Harbourfront Centre Theatre here in Toronto. And when that was going through a process of needing to be reglazed for it's a formal ice house on the lakeshore here in Toronto, in the docklands of on Lake Ontario, and the lobby is created by a glassed atrium surrounding it. And integrated into that in the latest refurbishment of it was, instead of just creating the most energy efficient envelopment glazing possible, it also integrated experimental photovoltaic cells that a glass artist worked with to tell a story through a project called Water Glass of the history of the waterfront and its relationship to Toronto, creating about 2 kilowatts of electricity when the sun is on. Again, looking at those opportunities within that facility and within the modifications to the facility that look at connecting the cultural importance, the impact of their operation, and the audience experience. It's also worked its way into the type of work that's been created there. This is actually the virtual background that I have right now is a still from this show, in which in pairing together this ethos in the way that the campus was put together and within the programming, various pieces of performance programming work to also highlight these things. So what you're seeing here through Vox Lumen is a production which was entirely off-grid, using solar and deep cycle batteries. You can see the batteries in one of the solar generators associated with it, through partnerships with the local conservation authority and companies working within renewables to power the show and to prove that solar could be viable as an infrastructural solution to powering a full-length dance theater show at the end of February in Southern Ontario, not when you get a lot of daylight. So looking at the ambitious there. So we're looking at these ways in which these things interconnected. And one thing that I'll highlight, if you haven't seen it yet, and both of them are at this point, texts that have become very core to those working in design and thinking about these systems. Cradle to cradle approach to redesigning our systems and thinking through, especially in the context of the infrastructure that we're looking at, how we can sort of find these opportunities for efficiency that bridge these things together. The next area that I want to refer to is talking about a social aspect of it, which is around access. On the coast of California, there is a cable that connects most of North America to Hawaii and Japan. It becomes a piece of invisible infrastructure. This is a picture of it. It's the Manchester cable station. The closest significant community to it, there's a small town in Manchester of a few people, but there is actually a larger population centered adjacent to it. This is the Google Street View of that neighborhood. It's about 3 miles away, and this is actually the Point Arena Manchester Band of Pomo Indios reservation. And why this is interesting to highlight is that in this picture, you can't see it back in the mist, but this is adjacent to that on Manchester State Beach, and working on a project filming traditional dance in a traditional seaweed gathering spot. So looking at issues of food security and access become important issues of this interconnectedness that we're feeling. This project involved community work, working with youth from that reservation, traditional ways of communicating work here with one of our collaborators, Ross Kadee, who you can see in both his regalia and not, and then also creating these mixed reality performances in this landscape, looking around issues of food security. This is from a traditional acorn gathering spot adjacent to that, issues around sovereignty and land use, connected to Kanemoto, which is a sacred mountain, to the Pomo, which is also used as a broadcast tower, as you can see here. And the reason to highlight these things is around these issues of access and social access, that cable station that provides us with a high-speed connection to other parts of the world, that the reservation doesn't benefit from that, even though they are adjacent to each other, and that it is actually on traditional land that has traditional uses associated with it. There was a report that came out last year around 7 surprising things that could change the job market, and issues that that we're thinking about in terms of how we come into relationship with those who caretake the land appear in here as different ways in which we're going to see economic impacts that cause the job market and the economy to change based off of environmental change and climate change happening. And things that we've already seen in this year have significant impact. Wildfires, we may not actually remember because so much has happened since then, of all the wildfires with Australia being primarily in flames in the early part of this year, but also floods and mudslides that result from that across various areas of North America this last year, or over the last not necessarily just like last calendar year, but into the various worsening fire seasons, and also displacement of those climate refugees. And some of this is actually already built into some of our thinking. When Hurricane Sandy had a significant impact on New York City, a lot of what they were doing around flooding the subway and different aspects were things that had been in the work. The subway, to some extent, was designed to service this drainage, this emergency drainage system in the Plan YC planning document that at the time Mayor Bloomberg had put out. So we're seeing this encroaching climate affecting all of our cultural facilities. And we're seeing the impact of this on moving populations around, and the arts play a very important part around grappling with this reality. Around this issue of climate refugees, there is a strand of thinking around the accepting Syrian refugees, that a lot of that conflict is exacerbated, if not caused, by drought causing issues with food security. And that is caused within the UN High Commission on Refugees, within their report on planned relocation around upcoming climate refugee issues, to include the importance of culture within that. And we see this in small places as well. This is Kiribati, a small Pacific island nation. And there's a filmmaker named Victoria Burns who has an award-winning short film called Teneo, which is the Kiribati's word for mother. This is a picture of her mother on the right-hand side. And she's talking about the cultural artifacts that get created through the things like video, and that on the left-hand side you see is still from the video that this island that is considered to be one of the first that will be underwater with rising sea levels, that this is the only artifact that her mother, who currently lives in the UK, when she relocated there with her father, has to reflect back on this place. So when we talk about access to these various places and traditional food security and those issues, the arts play an incredibly important realm or aspect in making this visible. I also want to talk briefly about the future as well. And this is where I promised the dancing robots come into play. And talking a little bit about one of the areas of focus that we have around thinking around artificial intelligence, which may seem out of the reach of what we're talking about when we're talking about a gallery or a theater. But this plays into that infrastructural question and how everything works together. So at one point I had asked some people what they thought these interfaces would be, and I got funnier responses like this one. But it becomes a serious question, because one of the things that we have to think about in terms of our relationship to emerging technology, including AI, is that that's going to be one of the ways in which our systems are going to become more efficient moving forward. And there's an important part for the arts to play within this future that isn't just about programming and isn't just about the robots, because the way that we work. In some ways, this is going to have a significant impact on this image that I showed you before, the relationship between either of these sides. But when Google set AI out to make art, it came out with things like this, which are novel, it's sometimes disturbing, etc. But this is deep thought, attempt to recreate something along the lines of Starry Night. And you can see that it's primarily made up of fish and bird shapes like that. Because AI has an issue about it's not actually human. When looking at facial recognition, which many companies in the recent past have banned, you see that a lot of algorithms actually have an increasing error based off of a range of race and gender identification, where there's a 99% success rate in identifying older white men, and 1 in 3 Black women are misidentified. So there's embedded, and because of the data that it's fed or the way that the algorithms are created. We're dealing with an era of deep fakes. These are some examples from the Wall Street Journal, in that the left-hand side is looking at originating the images, generating the images on the right. On the right are entirely fabricated. And these have only become more evolved recently. And these are disturbing facts, especially in our current reality of political unrest and racial tension. So let's look back at the art for a moment. There's a corgi made out of corgis, out of an AI methodology. The largest donation to a Canadian university was recently made to create the Schwartz-Reisman Innovation Center, half of which will be about AI and taking up a large area here in downtown Toronto. But it gets simpler than that when we're talking about our cultural relationship to climate change and our cultural relationship to ways that we can approach sustainability through the way that we help to process this way that our energy markets are going to be moving forward. This is a light switch. Depending on your cultural context, for most of us in North America that would be tuning in now, this is in the off position. But if you were to go to Europe, this though you might have a different style of switch, its position would indicate that it's on the in the on position. And so even with this symbol binary piece of information, we know that there's difference. The arts have been processing how we think about our relationship with technology for a while. This is the best relatively, it's not necessarily even the first example, except for of sort of mixing motion capture with dance, which is Merce Cunningham's piece. This comes from the Jacobs Fellow Archives. And there are current researchers, such as Katie Kwan and Amy Levers, who are collaborators in a thing called the RAD Lab out of University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, and looking at the relationship between choreographing robots and robots choreographing people, and what the relationship is to that. And the importance for this, and you might say, why should I think about it, is because it takes a human to create something along the lines of this. This is will be the dancing robots that I promised. So that's a still from Cirque du Soleil, which unfortunately has recently declared bankruptcy after having to lay off a number of people because they're dependent on in-person presentation. That's a reality now. But we're looking at the choreography of robots designed and funded through defense funding by human individuals to create a sense of delight or to understand our relationship to them. At a much more basic level, Trika Creative, who also was I mentioned before in terms of the CCTA, ran another charrette in creating analog ways for artists to look at the relationship to AI, looking at these social aspects and taking advantage of that important social mechanism in which the arts partake or drive forward. Now, this is a little abstract. We have to talk about a number of practical things that get us to these points as well. But I want to highlight that a lot of our future thinking, a lot of our social thinking around access, around the impacts of climate change, around the changes in technology and our infrastructure have deep intrinsic links to the way that we work as artists, as arts presenters, as those who support arts. As well, and giving you a number of case studies and ways that the artists have engaged from an artistic side with it as well. I also want to give you, as we're coming to a close here, a number of practical pointers insofar as ways to start thinking about sustainability if, as this resonates or creates value systems and changes. Because our position at the CSPA has been an evolution away from, do we need a certification standard, to how do we embed sustainability as a value within our arts making communities to centralize the arts as a driver of sustainable societies because of their successes in these different dimensions of sustainability and the proven utility that we have in these different ambitious and sometimes strange directions into which it's grappling with what our next steps are going to be. But sometimes you just need some practical steps to get involved further, to have the tools to make these choices. So let's talk about some practical steps. If you're looking for more information about different ways in which culture and the future of sustainability link together, I'm going to point to work around cultural adaptations. Creative Carbon Scotland has just culminated a project. There was supposed to be a conference immediately before the climate change meeting in November in Glasgow. It's been moved till March, and the climate change meeting has been moved by a year. But they've been working on what is the significance of embedding artists within organizations towards the end of climate change, of taking the artistic approach to developing ideas around change and having that be the function of it as opposed to metric functions. So working with organizations of all different types and prioritizing sustainable change by embedding artists and arts practitioners and arts practices within those organizations to imagine how to adapt that culture. We run, and you can find it on our website as going to tools. We run a number, we keep a catalog of currently viable tools for starting to look at the analysis of various organizations. We do the research work ourselves, so you can also find under reports ways that we've approached that. One of the easiest ways to start to do this, and we're starting to see, and we've been doing work on the transformation of their platform to a Canadian context in a way that hopefully will be applicable within a US context. Because of funding structures, it's actually become tricky to move this around. Arts Council England in 2012 partnered with Julie's Bicycle, a nonprofit around integrating sustainability into the cultural sector, to develop a more approachable, more consistently usable tool that all funded Arts Council England organizations could use to meet a mandate that they were that they required a level of environmental reporting. These tools are free to use. You can go to ig-tools.com. They've been going through a rebranding process. They used to be called the Industry Green Tools. They're now called the Creative Green Tools. They're working on a certification standard in the places where there are partnerships. As I mentioned, the CSPA is working with a number of partners around adaptation for these into Canada as well, with the hope that these become applicable south of the border as well. They allow you to go through, and I'm giving you an example from a theatrical screenshot that I took here, but they go through any number of different arts events and gallery spaces as well to come up with a basic understanding of your carbon footprint. It's a really good tool for starting to understand different ways that you can make change now, because you can continue to alter the data. The conversion factors, which is the main reason that you may not use them, or you may not want to use them for publishing data, are based off of UK power and UK resource consumption. The UK actually has much dirtier power than most of North America because of the way that it's generated. But that depends heavily on where you're located. But it gives you a sense, and especially if you start to track it over a series of events or a series of seasons, it will give you a sense of ways of improving and adds that data in. One of the upsides of it is that in identifying the location that you're in, and it's free to use, that at a point in the future at which there might be a tool that has the appropriate conversion factors that apply to you locally, that it would automatically do that. The numbers themselves are relatively agnostic to the conversions. They do it based off of location. The only other thing you have to be mindful of is that when it labels money, it labels them as with the pound symbol, though the math is unaffected by that. So it's an easy tool to start to use if you use nothing else. It's free for you to sign up for. That gives you an early snapshot of especially production to production. Though it's primarily Los Angeles based, a good model to look at, especially if you're looking at implementing something across a larger community and as it interrelates, is the Arts Earth Partnership. They do a certification process that's the official cultural green business certification for the County of Los Angeles, and has been supported through the City of Santa Monica as well, and applies across museums, galleries, theaters, various types of organizations with facilities that we're attempting to create a way to certify the various facilities and connect them with the resources to make them greener operators. So they offer a lot of great resources and have a surveying tool that's available and that you can connect with them to create, to learn more about what you can do as your next steps. A lot of their resource and their partnerships are based around local Los Angeles area resources, but it becomes an excellent model for looking at it as a full community, especially one that engages with municipal government. If you're looking for something simpler about how to make choices and you're running a theater organization, it's available on our website and through some other resources, but the Moello Theater the Green Theater Choices Toolkit from Moello Theater, which is itself now defunct, but its resources now available, has actually, they went through a process about 10 years ago, and the guidance is still applicable, of looking at various types of materials commonly used in artistic production. They're focusing primarily on performance production, but applicable in anything that's looking at temporary production. A lot of I know that a lot of the shops that I interact with through this work are not strictly scenic shops, and so that they also consider the variations of this when they're looking at their interior architecture projects or installation projects or other types of commercial installs. The Broadway Green Alliance has resources for how to start to integrate this within in shows and backstage in the management through their Green Captains program, and it creates a lot of resources not just around Broadway, but around the entire theater sector, but starting as a project of the Broadway League. Our own research and overlapping to others has been around power analysis and the actual powerness around cultural, the power usage around cultural facilities. You can see a now relatively old version of our show Power Facts analysis that it evolved into this study done by Fisher, Dox, and Associates when they redid Seattle Rep, and looking at where we start to get this data around the offsetting capability of cultural facilities. We generate a number of supports or reports around this ourselves. We're working on one right now with the NAC around the recent online programming. You'll also find on our website in that report section a report around the Fusebox Festival. I'd also point to all of the great research and reporting that's been done with Choice Bicycle as guidelines to different cultural facilities. The Fusebox Festival, which incorporates is a time limited festival. At the time that this study was done, it was a 12-day festival of visual and performing arts, but looking at a combination of audience interactions, and what you're seeing here is a graph day to day of the carbon emissions going down into the brown, and the costs and the local revenue generation going into the green, and actually the black dividing line that you might see there is actually the cost of the carbon offset that grows and shrinks along with that. So looking at how these things can come together. There's an ever-growing library of information, just some examples, some newer, some older here, but excellent places to start that I can help make available after this as well and leading up to our next session. And all this gets back to this idea of this thing that we were talking about, is that right now we're in this place where we understand that we build community and individual identity. We know that we have this impact on local economies and bringing people together. In many ways, when we do look to our future recovery, the utility of the arts is going to be essential to rethinking the way that our society will function, though oftentimes in our reopening plans, cultural facilities are moving towards the end because we're thinking about the number of people that congregate in a space together, but the importance of community identity and grappling with these changes and the trauma that we've been through together in these closures is an important function of the arts. And I'm hoping for advocacy that goes around really putting arts as the center for recovery. You see this actually as a historical model for why the Edinburgh Festival exists in the first place. Or why here in Toronto, the Luminato Festival, which came out of an effort towards recovering after the SARS, which hit this city relatively hard, that the importance of bringing artistic and cultural content for bringing people together again after an event like that is extremely important. And we see that through this data, through the Julie's Bicycle data collection, our individual reporting, that actually there is a significant positive environmental impact in bringing people together. All of that's changed in the last few months. So I'm always hesitant to do the link between COVID and climate crisis, except for the fact that we're looking at what global crisis looks at right now. So we should be thinking about how we interact with the climate crisis, which still hasn't gone away. We just have something more immediate in the future. So I'll leave you with the questions and then we'll move on to your questions of thinking about, to you specifically, as you think about the values within your organization, whether or not you're looking at it from a very practical standpoint, or you're looking at how it influences the entire organizational or project-based decision-making, or your interaction as artists and makers with funders and policymakers around what is a sustainable culture and what is a culture of sustainability and how do we support that together? And then what is the sustainable world we're building for and who is it for? I have to give a little bit of thanks to a number of different contributors, including especially our Indigenous contributors who appeared in that work because of the way that we work together and some of the questions there. But I'll thank you and take a breath, take a sip of water, and open it up to our own questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen for the time being.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, Marta had posted in the chat just the depth and the breadth of the information that you're sharing. This feels like it could be a weekend workshop, and I'm sure you lead those in that way. So
strange times in that way.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll open it up for questions, and actually Marta with Eco Arts had started out. Maybe Marta, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute, and we can kick off with that as a question. And if anyone else has questions, please select the hand in the participants box, and then we'll move through those one by one. Go ahead, Marta.
Okay, so Ian, my God, I've never heard you speak before and my head hurts.
It's a lot.
It's like so much stuff.
You didn't share the anecdote about the last time that we were supposed to present together about how I never got there. I had to present remotely.
Really quickly, I'll tell everybody. So Ian is the total and utter tech guru, and we were doing this presentation at the Association of Performing Arts Presenters in New York City, which is the largest gathering of performing arts presenters in the world for their annual thing. And Ian had all the tech on his computer because he knows about tech and none of us did. And I'm Xeroxing things very calm because I have lots of time before it starts, that panel. And Ian calls me and says, my plane is not landing. It was coming from Toronto and it almost landed in LaGuardia and it turned around because of the fog and went back. So anyway, we had to cope without his brilliant
I
tech.
called in.
It was just, it was a sad thing, but it worked this time, which is really, really great. My question is an idiot's guide question.
Yes.
Say you're a good, well-intentioned human and you are new to this and you don't know the acronyms and you don't even know what LEED certified means, which if you could explain, that would be great. And is, like where do you start? Like, especially now, and especially where's the best bang for your buck in terms of reflecting on your own behavior and your organization's behavior?
Right. So I'll start with just the simplest part of your question, which is LEED certification is leadership in energy and environmental design. So out of the United States Green Building Council and in partnership with the NRDC, it's a certification scheme for construction that that has a checklist model for looking at innovation in sustainable building. It's ever evolving. Some parts of it have been codified as well. I think that's one of the end goals with it. From some of my inside sources, from some of the people that I know that have been working on it as well. But it's an approach that if you're looking at renovating a facility or an interior that it is one of the places that you could start with saying that I'm going to operate a building sustainably. So the first place, and this is sometimes this is anticlimactic, but sometimes this is a huge sigh of relief, but consistently, the first place that I suggest people to go is, or the first thing that I suggest that they do, is to make art that engages their audience. Because of all the factors that we talked about, one of the big takeaways, and perhaps this is the TLDR version, is that one of the most important things that we can do is actually the creation of the work itself. I think that where we go from there, it depends on the approach that you're taking, whether or not you're an individual or you're an organization of a different size, whether or not you're coming at it from an external supporter as well, like outside of the art making process, but supporting it either a funder, a policymaker, a art service organization, all of those in terms of parts of the arts ecosystem in coming together. The first place that if you've got no other time, the Julie's Bicycles tools, the IG, now CG tools, are an excellent place to start. I know that I gave a lot of caveats for where to consider them, but what they benefit from and what somebody engaging with them can benefit from, regardless of the fact that there is the conversion factors that will be specific to one place or another. Again, underscoring the importance of specificity towards where you're working, because power gets generated in different ways. There's different, like if you're in the Pacific Northwest, it might be better to work with local lumber, whereas if you're in an area that's not the center of the forestry industry and doesn't have easy access to sustainable lumber in the same way, you might go with different forms of construction for larger things. But all of that being said, those tools are based around the fact that Arts Council England at one point said, we want to require everybody who's receiving funding from us to do some level of environmental reporting. Because of their funding structure, it's a mandate that they can make, which is a benefit to them. But they needed, and ended up working with Julie's Bicycle, needed a tool to make it so that even the smallest arts organization could approach the changes that they were looking to have made. So that somebody could do a level of reporting that took into consideration the fact that we have limited capacity, limited time, limited resources into what we're doing. Now, you can do much more extensive than that. Either, we as the CSBA have done large reports over multi-year studies of individual festivals with really intense detail. Julie's Bicycle has done similar types of things, and then also field-wide things around like multi-day large music festivals and touring out of their research initiatives as well. But if you're just getting started out, the primary things that I emphasize are, one, focusing on the artwork and making that engaging with the audiences and knowing who you're making it for and being intentional with that. Doing whatever approachable measurement thing that you can do, and the Julie's Bicycle tools makes that extremely easy. and then not isolating what you're doing within a specific department. A lot of this is geared towards, a lot of this presentation, perhaps to the expectations or not of those who are in attendance, is much more around articulating the values and the importance of the arts that we're making. And what we have found that because of those other two factors, if you start measuring and know where your impacts are, it makes it easier to make the decision. It'll become obvious different areas where you can improve your emissions. So you'll say, that's really high, that's something that I can improve. And it takes a little bit of information to know what your specific situation is, and knowing that you're making the art that's engaging with minds. I'll give, because I'm going to veer into a little bit of an anecdote. There's an arts organization, a large arts organization here in Toronto that did an environmental study to start their environmental initiative in 2005, 2006. And in looking at their carbon footprint, they found that around 95% of it was just from audience travel, because they had many people. They have a campus-wide operation, offer lots of free programming and festivals throughout the summer season, have a programmed visual and performing arts season year-round. And with all of those factors, the entire operation that they had direct control of, if they ceased doing all of that, they'd eliminate about 5% of their carbon footprint. So the importance becomes about how we interact with those audiences. So it becomes about making the work, doing what we can to improve what we're doing. And the best way to make the choices of doing that is being able to have a shared value across the organization. And so a lot of the work that we now do is around empowering people around change management and how to utilize the data that is useful to them, and that they can actually wrangle into making strategic decisions that work within their context. So those are sort of like the three things. But if you're going to do nothing else, I'd start with the Joey's Bicycle tools, because those are free, accessible. We'll start to give you a snapshot. Once you use them twice, you start to see different areas where you can easily start to make improvements. Pair that with values and art making, and then you start to get to a place where you can make really strategic change across your practice, an individual project or series of projects, or an organization.
So I'm just going to quick, and then people jump in, and because I don't want to hog this conversation. So I'm sitting here at the Dairy Arts Center. Mm-hmm. Can I do things, because I am such a math challenged person. When you say measurement, it makes the hives on my skin rise. Because, I mean, obviously I'd have to get other people to do that. But I mean, can I look at things like, okay, lights, okay, heat or air conditioning, okay, ingredients of paint, okay, do you know what I mean?
Right. I mean, if you see a number and you run the other way, there's something to get over there as well. Right. But they really break it down in a really easy way. They're trying to, they are designed around that sort of, that there might be an individual, one staff person that's year round that is trying to get that information. And it will give you the number based off the information that you put in it. You don't have to enter everything. So when I've engaged with organizations who have started to do this, sometimes they can do lighting. Sometimes they can do the material they use for construction. Sometimes they can do it around their communication strategy. Sometimes they're doing it around front of house and all these different things that factor into that. And they'll get information about that. Some of that's easier to obtain. Like if you're looking at just, one of the biggest areas of impact that sometimes, the biggest areas of impact tend to be the ones that are the least arts oriented. They're the refrigerators for concessions, the air conditioner for your space, the lighting in your hallways and offices, because those things are always on. Arts content tends to be in a very controlled period of time that it's being presented, right? We don't tend to have the lights on when a gallery is not open or when a theater show is not running. But other lights and other appliances may be, especially if you can't plug them. You're not going to unplug your refrigerator in the break room every day. And those things have their power, the power printed on them. So it becomes very easy math to get to do if you know how to get those numbers. And those are excellent places to start, because those actually tend to be the biggest impact areas. Actually, it's actually not that sexy or exotic to say I need to go look at all of this specialized equipment that I might need. we are dependent upon, we are part of a larger society. We're dependent upon all the innovation and changes and appliances and things like that that happen throughout the world. We have less influence on material innovation than the construction industry. It's much larger than us. So we benefit from a lot of the change that's been happening there as well. You're not going to have to go digging for like, you could go through the Bath University inventory of carbon equivalents. You're not being asked to do that. You're asked to look at the labeling on the existing things that you have. And oftentimes what we've found is that in the areas that are applicable, that, you know, building that into an early conversation, if it's not somebody who's full-time, so if you hire a production manager or somebody to manage or build a project on like a contract basis or things like that, but building that into the question ahead of time, which is just saying that I want to, you know, if you're constructing an exhibition or you're constructing a theater set, you have all the information, like you have all the material information that comes in there. And that system does simplify it quite a bit, where it turns it into like a volume of information. So it's like how much lumber, not how many of these specific things, because it's crazy making to try and look at all the individual things in it. So it is designed specifically around and ever evolving to make it approachable.
Ian, we're coming close to our time, but I want to get to a question. Lynn Siegel has her hand raised. Lynn, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
So Ian, going back to your slide of the drone harvesting the field, what was your thought of what that farmer would do afterwards?
Well, I think that we're seeing actually, interestingly, in this question that was posed from COVID, we're seeing a lot of it in that we have, we're not in our places of work in the same way that we were before. So part of the reason that conversation came up is that when somebody has additional time, thinking that they'd be engaging within some cultural activity. Now that is inclusive, especially in this moment, of streaming content, of television, and those more standard broadcast ways of doing it, or things that have been put online more recently that may have previously been primarily in-person experiences before. But as we're freeing up this efficiency, as we're moving it into an offloading this from human control, and we open up those things, how do we fill that time? And what do we make useful? And that also bridges into, I think, this question of the impact that the work that we're making, however somebody engages with that moving forward. So I'm hoping that they're engaging with cultural content. I'm leaving that open to the vast majority of things that could include. I think that we're seeing a lot of an evolution in access to a lot of content right now that I think might make that more available than what had previously been on television.
Good, that's kind of what I thought you might say, but I didn't want to put words in your mouth.
No,
I think we're coming to a renaissance of going back to the arts. And
I hope so, and I agree, and I think that's an important part. Like I said, I think that's one of the ways that we're going to get to a sustainable future. Actually, is to put culture at the center of our future.
And a guaranteed annual income, whatever they call that, you know, because that drone is so efficient and you can do it. So why not? It's fabulous. Thanks.
Thank you, Lynn. And that might be, I had one closing question. We don't have any other hands raised, so I'll throw mine in the hat, maybe just briefly. One of the most interesting things that you said, Ian, I thought was that just engaging in art practice is already supportive of a sustainable future. And I'm originally trained as an architect, and the running line in the architecture sustainable world for a while was the greenest building that you can have is the one that you don't build. And so as an artist, I find it actually it is important that we make art and that we put it out there, and the ways that we do it have an impact, but the making of it itself also has an impact. And I wonder if you have any closing thoughts on that before we wrap.
Back to sort of one of the core ideas that we're never going to get away from the fact that there's an impact across all of the making that we're doing. And to some extent, we do have to, we have to get past, I wouldn't say we completely erase it, but we have to get past any, like, our guilt around making. Because we're always going to be making things. It's interesting. I also originally trained as an architect. We've talked about that before. And I've heard something similar, but I always think about it as like the greenest building is the one that you already have, and talking about adaptive reuse and thinking about how we become the most, how we don't necessarily think about our systems as what we don't have, but come from a place of we have plenty. And so in our making of things, part of that is culture, part of that is ideas. As long as we're consciously thinking about how we're using those things, and this gets to that value statement, if we're valuing the things that we're making them out of, and we're trying to engage with culture and artistic content in this expansive way that we're imagining what the future of society is, there is a value exchange between the environmental impact that we're going to have, and we're constantly making that too because we exist. We're taking up resources because we exist. So there's a value exchange between those sustainable metrics that we have and the future that we have, where sustainable, and this is why I'm attached to this idea of sustainable development, is that there can be plenty now and there can be plenty later. We just have to think about it smartly. We can make things. We shouldn't feel like the question of being sustainable is about always taking things away. It's about articulating value and being conscientious with the way that we make things.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. We are at our time. I'm going to toss to Marta that just also wanted to mention there was a question in the chat that said from Emily Volk, are there any next steps for the Boulder arts community? And wonderful segue that actually the part 2 of this series next Tuesday will focus on that. And Marta, if you can speak to that briefly and close this out. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yep, and so it's going to be actually Tuesday, July 7th, same time, same place. And thank you, Ian, and all of you audience folks for coming. There is going to be, as we said earlier, recording of tonight's webinar is going to be available on the BCAA website toward the end of next week, as I understand it. And I'm the pretend Charlotte Lisasso at this moment because Charlotte has lost her voice, and I especially want to have a shout out to her for having the vision to have brought in here and for all of her work. For those of you that don't know, the BCAA is providing incredible information and resources about the arts and arts organizations in Boulder County since 1966. And it's a source of programming and a wealth of information about grants, gigs, resources, arts activities, blah, 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 blah. If you're not a member, go to their website. Great time to join, especially now during COVID. They have lots of online stuff coming up. Thanks a lot to our sponsors, especially the City of Boulder Office of Arts and Culture, as well as Colorado Creative Industries, Science and Cultural Facilities District, to our real news media sources, Boulder Daily Camera and KGNU Radio that did interviews with Ian for this event, and to Sam Randall and the Arbor Institute and David for hosting, and Eco Arts Connections, and especially Ian. Thank you so much for coming.